Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Kevin May, the editor-in-chief at PhocusWire. This is PhocusWire Flash, the crisis in Ukraine. We thought it would be useful, given the rapid development of events over the last 2 weeks, to kind of convene some experts in different areas of the industry to talk about what has been going on so far, the efforts of the industry to view the crisis and make some moves, and also what we think might be some of the outlooks. As we all know, it's a rapidly moving situation. So sadly, some of this may well be out of date within a few days, but we do appreciate everybody for joining in today. There are hundreds of you that have registered, which is terrific. So before I introduce my guests here, I'm just going to go through what we say will be the broad kind of talking points for the next half an hour or so. We thought it'd be useful to start with the humanitarian efforts that have been put in by the industry. That's the companies and the sectors as a whole. The actions taken so far by the industry to close down their operations in Russia. There's been lots of that in the mainstream press about the efforts that are being taken there. The economic impact of the sanctions on the industry and the economic impact of the loss of tourism from inbound and outbound Russia and the wider region. They are a very large traveling public, as it were. So there's going to be some impact there. A brief moment, we'll talk about what some of the lessons that have learned from COVID about how the industry has pulled together in responses to crises. And then maybe we'll try and look at the outlook of to where we see things developing over the next weeks or so. So thank you very much for listening to that part. I'm going to now introduce you to my guests, as I said. First of all is Julia Simpson. She's the CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council. Thank you very much, Julia, for joining us. Next is Brian Hoyt. He's the Head of Industry Affairs and Global Communications at Tripadvisor. He's in North America today. And last but no means least is Nikita Dedic. He's the CEO of road.travel. I guess representing the startup community, because they have obviously lots of input on various things like this as well. So I think it would be, as I said at the beginning in my kind of agenda, is I think it would be useful to start with the humanitarian elements to this crisis. As many would agree, that's probably the best place to start, given it would be insensitive to dive into the kind of the economic impact of this. So I'd like us to address those first of all. As many know, many brands, Hilton, Airbnb, just to name a few, have offered room nights, for example, to refugees that are coming out of Ukraine. Airbnb's money to host projects, which was an interesting development. So you could actually book a room on Airbnb in the Ukraine, not take up the stay, but the host of that property in the Ukraine would be getting some revenue from that. So that one in particular has drawn a lot of attention for its, I guess, innovation in doing something interesting. First of all, Brian, if we can come to you, I mean, Tripadvisor launched a campaign through its foundation. Just talk to us about how quickly that was to set up and the success of that and some kind of metrics and just the thinking behind that, first of all, Brian. And again, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And this is a great topic to talk about. You know, look, Tripadvisor also has left its vacation rental listings open in Ukraine. So folks can go and check those out. But we've really been working for years, as you know, Kevin, through the Tripadvisor Foundation. Tripadvisor itself has a long history of working to support displaced persons, often refugees that have, by no fault of their own, been forced to flee their homes because of war. So we've been active in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Syria over the years, raising millions of dollars for groups like the IRC and Mercy Corps, which are helping with refugee resettlement issues. For this cause in particular, we decided, you know, especially at first when we saw hundreds of thousands, now we're up to nearly 2 million plus people fleeing Ukraine because of the Russian invasion that's happening there right now. We have seen a tremendous humanitarian need to do some very simple things like feed people on the ground. And so we're really pleased to have partnered with World Central Kitchen. And to date, we have raised more than $3 million, inclusive of a $250,000 initial match from the Tripadvisor Foundation. And that money has largely come from donors in the United States that are a part of the Tripadvisor community. Throughout the course of this next week, we'll be increasing our match donations from the Tripadvisor Foundation as we solicit funds from other nations around the world. So we're really excited about the response that our community has had here in terms of stepping up to the plate. to support yet, unfortunately, this new group of refugees that will have generational impact across the world as they have been forced to flee their country.
Yeah, it's a tremendous effort, Brian. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, Julia, if we can come to you there, I mean, would you say there are any other initiatives that can be done, or that you would urge your industry members and partners to get involved with, first of all?
Yes, thank you for inviting me today. I'm really grateful that you're focusing on the humanitarian aspects of it, because obviously in business, you know, we do look at the economic impacts, but with all our members, we represent 200 of the top travel and tourism businesses. They've only spoken to me about the humanitarian aspects, and that is true. I mean, I completely agree. You know, our industry has got an enormous heart. And what we learned from COVID, and we'll come on to that later, is how well we have been working now with governments around the world to support in whatever crisis. I've been speaking to our members, hotels that own properties or run properties, both in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Poland. In Kyiv, we've certainly got properties there where it's quite interesting. You've got a mix of international observers, military people, you've got the NGOs, the Red Cross, etc. going in. You've also got some people that just got caught, customers that kind of got caught up in it and are staying there, and journalists. So at moments like these, the hotels provide absolutely critical hubs, not just in terms of looking after people, but in terms of getting messages out to the broader world. They're incredibly courageous. I was speaking to the CEO, Sebastian Bazin of Accor. He said that his hotel in Kyiv only had 3 days left worth of food, but they were absolutely not going to close the hotel. They were doing everything they can because they realized what an important hub it was. Meanwhile, in Poland, a lot of our members, as we've just been saying, have just opened their doors to refugees. Everybody there, they've given them food, warmth, advice, support. So, you know, we really, really do put our money where our mouth is when these terrible events occur.
Just on that, Julia, I mean, travel does have, you said, I mean, lots of governments and, you know, regional agencies are doing a lot of work. Do you sense that the WTTC would need to perhaps lobby for more, for governments to do more, or do you think that's a role that you would like others to do?
I mean, certainly governments will come to us and ask us, you know, what is needed, and we will help. But I have to say, on this particular occasion in the Ukraine, the unity that you've seen in governments around the world has been really impressive. And yes, they're all, you know, the sanctions, the move to impose the sanctions very, very fast. But, you know, we're also looking at the human aspect. A lot of our businesses, we employ Russian colleagues and Ukrainian colleagues. And when I put out a message about this, I said, you know, we stand in solidarity with Ukrainians and Russians who want to see a swift end to this crisis. So we're trying to keep it really, really human. And we're trying, I think, as an organization, it is for the big politicians of the world sometimes to see this as a them and us and a black or white, but we're trying to go the layer below and just trying to respond to that humanitarian support, request for support. I mean, so far, I have to say agencies have been brilliant.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And Nikita, if we can come to you for a moment. I mean, you're in an interesting situation. You are a startup in the travel industry. So, you know, at the opposite end of the scale to, you know, what Tripadvisor is doing. But you actually have a team in Russia, and I understand freelancers in Ukraine. So how do you manage that as a leader of an organization when you're, you know, there's two sides of a situation here?
Oh yeah, Kevin, thank you. A really good question that we don't have an easy answer for, especially in these turbulent times. Julia, thanks a lot for highlighting that you would like to both support Ukrainians and Russians, because what we're seeing recently, and I participated in a coverage from Bloomberg on that topic, where Bloomberg spoke to some expatriates in London who were born Russian or hold Russian passports. There is a movement these days, unfortunately, and I believe that comes naturally from human nature, to oppose the ones who look hostile. So not all Russians support this. It's just we need to make this clear. There are so many bright minds around the world working for multinational corporations, launching their own ventures. And I would actually really wanted to use this opportunity to make a sort of appeal to the industry and say, we are building a closer world. Our purpose, our big mission is to erase borders, not the way how it's happening in Ukraine these days, but through cultural exchange, through peaceful operations. So Kevin, back to your questions. Indeed, we are a UK-based startup, but we do historically have part of our research and development team in Russia. We do work with freelancers from Ukraine. Fortunately, inside the company and during those conversations, during those works, there is nothing hostile really happening between the team members. But we are already seeing some reactions from potential partners in other countries saying that, hey, we're seeing you have some Russian founders in the team. We don't want to work with Russians. And that is the challenge that we're facing alongside all those challenges that normally company founders face. Fundraising hadn't been easy for Russians prior to this. And now it's just, it's becoming toxic. But we'll do our best to go through this crisis together with the global world. Hopefully it'll end up soon.
I'd like to talk a little bit now, if I may, about some of the actions that the industry has taken. I mean, countless travel companies have ceased operations in Russia. Many have got, similar difficulties they will face in Ukraine. I mean, for example, air operations between Russia and elsewhere have been largely curtailed as a result of government or regional agency efforts to close airspace. Travel brands have moved quickly to suspend trips, close their offices, stop advertising on their sites. Let's look at TUI, for example, has faced some particular difficulties with Russian members of its board of directors. So, but there has been a very speedy, given this is all, we're only day 14 or day 15 in the actual military action of this crisis. But I mean, Julia, let me come to you first. Presumably, you've obviously been monitoring this swift progress. I mean, have you found any companies facing difficulties with their actions in trying to close operations or do things? And is there any guidance that you would share for companies that are still trying to think this particular issue through? One that was mentioned to me recently is getting their own staff out of Russia if they wish to get out.
Yes, I think as ever, these situations are quite complex, and where people are pulling out of Russia, a lot of that will be at a quite corporate level. And we've seen, the McDonald's and the Coca-Colas and some of the big brands, but sometimes lower down, there are complexities. Brands sometimes might own a hotel, but they might not run it, or they might be running the hotel, but they don't own it. So, there are complexities that I think people are dealing with in a very calm way and in a very, very kind of grown up way. We do value all our colleagues. We have lots of businesses, as I said, where Russians and Ukrainians work side by side. So yes, we have seen some of the big names pulling out, but there is some subtlety, I think, and also fair treatment of our colleagues that sit somewhere below that. And you've even seen that of the big news corporations like the BBC, to when do they pull out, to what degree do they stay there? So there's a bit of you have to protect people that you have in a country, but you also have a duty of care to the people that you employ in that country. It's subtle.
Yeah, Brian, we were talking yesterday ahead of this, and you said that people would be using the review section on Tripadvisor for a very, I think one of the words we discussed was kind of a noble cause initiative, but there was something that you wanted to discuss specifically about that.
Well, yeah, so Tripadvisor, just to be clear, has taken kind of a three-step approach to what we're doing in terms of operating in Russia and in Belarus, which has been participating in this action. So first and foremost, we have a number of contractors in Ukraine who we work with through third parties. TripAdvisor has worked with those companies that support the contractors supporting our business to help with their relocation, inclusive of TripAdvisor will continue to pay them and help with relocation expenses. And we're happy that we've been able to work with those companies to get so many of them out of harm's way. And our hearts and minds are with all of our colleagues, our TripAdvisor family, as we like to say, in the region. Two, we've made the decision to cut all commerce ties in Russia and Belarus. And so over the course of the next several days, increasingly on TripAdvisor, you will see there won't be access through hotel meta search to hotel properties in the region. There won't be access to experience bookings or vacation rentals in Russia or Belarus. And we'll pull all advertising down for those points of interest as well. And that's to take part in what we think is historic private sector action to communicate to the Russian government that we think this invasion is unjust, and we're asking them to choose peace over war. But third and foremost, TripAdvisor is really more of an information platform, as you know, Kevin, than we are like an online travel agency like Expedia or Booking, who I should also mention have pulled out booking properties and travel in the region. But as an information platform, our goal is to share information with travelers about any open business anywhere in the world. And so you can go to TripAdvisor today still and find businesses that are open for business, hotels, restaurants in Russia, North Korea, Iran, places that have been hugely controversial, as you know, Kevin, over the course of the last several years. Our point of view is that we do a disservice to travelers by delisting a business on our site. That delisting of a business puts travelers at harm. Not only does it ruin, potentially hurt their travel experience itself, it can hurt their personal safety. And so for that unsafe hotel or that restaurant that maybe doesn't take into account the personal safety matters of their guests, we want to make sure that those businesses are listing on our platform and that through our reviews, the good, the bad, and the ugly are available for everyone to read. But just recently, as you mentioned, the hacker group Anonymous suggested that as a means of activism, travelers or people could write about what's happening in Ukraine in our reviews. And while that's a noble gesture, our policies are that reviews have to be a firsthand account of a traveler's experience with that business or that point of interest. Now, the other thing is an individual review, it isn't going to necessarily get a lot of traffic. And there's a better place on TripAdvisor to share information about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and that's our forums. And so TripAdvisor's created spaces within our forums in the Russian and English language to ensure that hopefully the average Russian citizen who's accessing tripadvisor.ru can get access to information about what's happening in Ukraine from people who are there on the ground. And that's information, as we know, they might not be getting through official state resources right now. And so we think as an information travel guidance platform, that's the role that we can play in this effort. And information is power. And we hope that, the facts on the ground do get to the Russian people. And for the many brave Russians who have stood up against the decisions of their government, we applaud their efforts, their heroism, their courage, and we hope that this information is a small part of helping to resolve this situation in the region to something that's more peaceful than obviously what we're seeing today.
Nikita, you're in a fairly unique situation. I was reading a quote in the Washington Post, an item in there about you. I mean, your family is Ukrainian. They moved to Russia, where you were born, before moving to London in 2016. I mean, what are you hearing on the ground about the reaction of the West and the travel brands in particular, if you know, about effectively cutting off Russia? Are you hearing anything at all about what they think about the sanctions?
Well, I can say we are definitely seeing the effects of the sanctions. First of all, these were really swift, and I think the world is really reunited again very quickly to oppose this aggression. We're seeing that mostly all Western airlines have canceled their flights and closed Europe for flights from Russia and for Russian airlines. The leasing companies are taking away their planes from Russia. So the situation today is so unpredictable. It's like a whirlwind, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So we can definitely look at some sentiments coming from both sides. But again, the situation changes so rapidly. Sanctions will definitely lead to a significant impact on how people in Russia live, on how hopefully they perceive information, because, to a massive extent, what's going on today is due to state propaganda that had been building up for many years, and then was used to basically, convince people that the white is black, and vice versa.
Just if I may here, I mean, from some of our sources and contacts in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia, and we've been hearing that cyber warfare is being seen as an entity never experienced before. I mean, just briefly, are you hearing anything at all about reports of that? We write specifically about the online travel industry. It's a very tech-led industry these days. Is that something that you've heard from any of your sources, or any of you? Is it impacting anything that you're hearing at all, Brian?
Yeah, well, I'm included in a few travel startup groups in Russia, and for Russian-speaking founders. From what I can see, the industry there is just paralyzed.
Right.
It's calm. I mean, people do exchange some updates about just another airline or another big brand announcing leaving Russia, but it's now a universal solution. If you look at most global brands, they either suspend operations, or at least they suspend all investments. Well, because it makes sense from a business perspective in the first place. You need to preserve the investment you make to create returns on those investments. But in this situation, it's not about the finances. It's about the supporting the right cause. So again, the industry is thinking internally how to repurpose the tools that they have. They're looking for some solutions to replace the big distribution systems, like the biggest airline, Aeroflot, has recently been pulled out of Sabre, and they are currently changing to another distribution systems. There are some replacements for some technologies that are being used in travel, and they could make it possible to for things to run smoothly enough, I can say. But that doesn't create tourism, because tourism is a global phenomenon. Without people coming to the country, you're not doing tourism.
If I could just add to that, Kevin, I think I think if you're Expedia, Booking, Tripadvisor, any travel Sabre, any business in the West that's participated in some of the activism that we've seen in trying to encourage the Russian government to stop their actions in Ukraine. I think the idea of cybersecurity is top of mind for everyone. And I know that every one of our companies is working to shore up the defenses of our businesses so we can maintain our operations. We're fighting hacker activity every day in the internet industry. And we know, because of the positions that we're taking as an industry, that there is likely, some more activity coming our way out of Russia. And so it's just something that we have to be vigilant for and prepared for as an industry. And I know that there's a lot of partnership with the ethical hacking community right now to shore up defenses. And look, the sad part of this all, Kevin, is it didn't have to be this way. We were working towards an international economic level of prosperity that has been unheard of. And there's no reason that there has to be winners and losers in this fight. There's an opportunity still for the West, for Russia, for China to share the global prosperity that is open and available to us all. And the decisions that have been made by certain individuals within the Russian government to throw that all aside is disappointing. And so, look, at the same time, while we're all taking a stand, we're all preparing for what may come our way as well.
Okay, if we can shift gears a little bit and get on to the kind of the economic impact of this. I mean, the industry is, some might argue, trying to emerge from a crisis that has lasted over 2 years. That's COVID-19, if anyone can remember that just 2 weeks ago. Although our minds are focused in, I think, in a different way with this latest crisis, because there are so many humanitarian concerns, there must be some unease about the economic economic sanctions, how they will play out across the industry again. So for context here, the Russian outbound travel market expenditure was around 36 billion in 2019, pre-COVID times. We're already hearing that Hyatt, Hilton and Accor is freezing development in the country. These are big signals that this is a long-lasting impact, even if, fingers crossed, we get something of a ceasefire nature in the next days and weeks. But Julie, if we can come to you first, this must be causing some degree of concern for an industry already attempting to recover from COVID-19.
Yes, I think if you look at the impact COVID-19 had on travel and tourism globally, it actually cut our contribution to global GDP by 50%. So our sector's GDP went down by 50% globally. If you look at the impact of generally of global GDP from COVID, it was about 3.4, 3.7%, depending on which stats you look at. And that was the impact. So our industry has already been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and we have seen massive loss of businesses. Everyone says we are very resilient, and it is a resilient sector. But I think there have been a lot of casualties as well during this time, and we lost 62 million jobs. We were looking globally, we were looking at getting back. If the Ukraine war hadn't happened, we were hoping by the end of 2022 we were going to be able to restore the majority of those jobs globally. Now, obviously, there is a question mark over that. So, yes, it is a humanitarian crisis, but it's an economic crisis that has humanitarian consequences for peoples whose livelihoods depend on travel and tourism.
Yeah. Brian, I'm curious how a travel brand like Tripadvisor, which has obviously had to navigate like everybody else over the last few years, how do you approach a strategy around this situation? Do you think on a day-by-day basis, because the situation is moving very fast? Can you talk, I think it would be very useful for those that are tuning in about what you're kind of thinking, how to kind of play out the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe don't represent significant material, what I would say, amounts of traffic coming to Tripadvisor. They're growing emerging regions, or they were growing up until this point. And we were looking forward to making more inroads throughout Russia and Eastern Europe as we grew our business. Our base of operations is largely, as you know, Kevin, in North America, Western Europe, and the growing Asia Pacific region. And I think coming out of the pandemic, what we're heartened to see is, despite the activity that is happening right now in Ukraine, that there is still strong travel demand coming out of this pandemic in so many other regions of the world right now. And right. We're while we're taking care of those and supporting the people of Ukraine with some of the actions that we've taken, we're also preparing for this wave of tourism demand this spring to come back, where we're seeing, more than half of Americans telling us in the United States that they plan to travel. The same type of high demand in the UK. There's an expectation people will spend more. After 24 months of being cooped up at home, there is just massive demand and hunger, despite higher oil prices, despite what we're seeing as kind of inflation across the board. People want to get out there again and see the world. And so it's sad to see how little activity is happening right now in the regions that have been impacted because of this Russian invasion into Ukraine. But we're heartened to see that the world is forming, these connections again through the power of travel, as in the rest of the world, as I like to say, people are getting back out there to see all that's good out there in this world again.
And yeah, I'll just chip in there. I completely agree with that assessment. And the point I would also add is Asia Pacific, that is still quite closed. China's effectively closed, but it is beginning to open. At WTTC, we're going to hold a massive summit at the end of April. And we've got in the Philippines, we've got massive take up. Japan is beginning to open. So there are whole regions of the world. I agree with America, enormous pent up demand. They are traveling, but watch Asia Pac as that opens, because there's going to be, really a reignition of travel and tourism across that region.
And yeah, Julie, we see a direct correlation to markets opening with massive demand spikes in those markets. In Australia right now, we're seeing so much activity. as well, Japan, and so we'll have a contingent there in Manila as well for the WTTC event, and we're looking forward to getting out there as a business and seeing the world again. It will
certainly be interesting to see whether the unsettling part of it hits consumer confidence if things start developing in Eastern Europe any more than they are, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Nikita, quickly with you. As a startup that has ridden through one crisis as well, it's not easy being a startup in the travel industry anyway, but here you are, you've made it through to this part. I mean, having to face another one must be equally unsettling. I mean, how do you and startups just kind of navigate such events as these?
We barely do,
right.
But we do our best to go through this. Well, yeah, like I said, we're receiving some signals, some sad signals, just because we're Russian-born, or some of us are Russian-born. We do have people working in Russia. We do explore relocation options for our key team members, at least, to move them out of Russia. And it's just a part of our team. But anyway, this is something that we are already facing. It doesn't help with any further developments. We even had to postpone the announcement of our Series A rounds that has recently happened, just because of that. Because, in the current context, well, first of all, it's not the time to celebrate any wins. It just doesn't make sense. And our cultural and historical background doesn't help either. But yeah, we're looking for ways to, we are a distributed team, a global team of about 30 people now. We're hiring right now, and we are looking at different geographies and different countries to hire the best talent from. So.
Julia, just on this subject, back to you for a moment, if we can briefly. I mean, if this does prolong, do you think the industry will start being a little bit more discerning, by which I mean they will perhaps start working with independent Russian travel brands rather than government-owned travel brands?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? I think it's too early to say. I think, as we've been commenting here, the reaction has been to such horrendous atrocity everyone is so appalled, they're just pulling everything out. But I think, it is interesting, as with my comment about, we do extend a hand of friendship to Russians that want to seek peace and respect sovereign boundaries and nation states. I think it's really interesting. It could be a bit of a new world order where you are, even, we were just saying in Tripadvisor how we're getting sort of connections that are going under the politics. So let's watch and see that. It would be very interesting. But I think actually travel to Russia is going to be incredibly difficult, because there will be, effectively, there already are travel bans, so people will not go there. And let's be honest, people will not feel very safe to go there either. So, but I take the point. I like the idea, but I'm also hoping and praying that it does stay well contained. I mean, it's still terribly awful and horrendous, but that it does kind of contain geographically.
A question for any of you, really, whoever jumps in first. So, I mean, are there any lessons that the industry has learned about collective responses based on what we've all been through over the last 2 years that we can perhaps either implement now or modify to help an industry get through what will be, as we've been discussing, probably some economic woes over the next 6 months or whatever?
Well, I'll kick off. Certainly COVID, the relationships that we built between the travel and tourism sector and government were so strong. I mean, in parts of the Caribbean, for example, a lot of hotels and hotel owners were critical, not just to the distribution of the vaccine, but to the distribution of the narrative of why the vaccine was safe and why it was important to get it, not just within the hotel, but for all the supply lines and all the friends and family in the community that surround hotels. So they took a real leadership position. And what's been so interesting, in the Caribbean, the relationship has improved so much that they're also talking now about joining together to solve issues such as crime. I mean, it's been really interesting. And other examples, in COVID, as I'm speaking to you today from the UK in London, all the hotels got together and they had, when it was very, very bitter last winter here in the UK, they had this campaign led by a wonderful woman called Louise Casey called All In, and all the hotels, just all the homeless people that lived in the city of London were just scooped up and brought into hotels that couldn't fill their hotel rooms anyway because of COVID and some of the restrictions around traveling. So there have been some, and we're seeing the way Tripadvisor has been, they're working some incredibly creative ideas. So I think we will see some of that new thinking and new working. The obverse to that, though, I have to say, what we did find in COVID is at a nation state level, people turned inwardly. And in fact, they are saying that some of that kind of ultra patriotism that has a slightly uglier side to it, some of that has been around COVID, where nation states have turned inward and sadly sometimes politicize COVID. And that's why we had ridiculous situations where you had global scientists like the WHO saying, do not close frontiers. It will not solve the problem of the virus spreading, because viruses, believe it or not, they don't stand still at a frontier. And it was absolutely proven to be true, but governments often didn't want to hear that. They were very much focusing on the politics in their own country, and so we saw a little bit of small nation state creeping in as well. So I think working with our governments inside an individual country has improved. Working sometimes internationally has not been so good.
Yes, and nationalism is not something that has helped many crises over the years. Brian?
No, I can't agree more with Julia and Kevin. You know, travel is the antidote to isolationism. The very act of bringing people together, travel, you know, Mark Twain has that famous quote that travel is the antidote to curing things like bigotry and prejudice. I'm paraphrasing, but it is literally a sign our CEO has on the wall of his office that he cites often. You know, I remember as a younger man, after the Soviet Union fell, meeting a group of Russian sailors during Fleet Week in New York. And that very interaction that I had, we exchanged gifts, and the Russian soldier gave me a coin and he pointed to the back of it. He said, no more hammer and sickle, in broken English. He said, you know, it was the two eagles of the Russian Federation. I think it was eagles. I may be messing that up. But, you know, that interaction I had have stayed with me for 20 plus years since it happened. It was more than 20 years ago. And that's the power of travel. That's the power of bringing people together and to developing this sense of kind of openness amongst cultures and understanding. And, you know, we need to go back to the days of Reagan and Gorbachev, where we're talking to each other. And we're opening up our societies and not closing them. And travel can go a long way towards doing that. So I'm really proud of this historic private sector effort by so many companies in the travel and hospitality industry to take a stand here and to fight for a better future, because we know the industry that we represent can be a solve for, you know, what is this isolationism, this nationalism that we're seeing today. So
I think what will be interesting is, you know, as we've seen over during the last 2 years with COVID, this kind of collective action and by the industry, and now whether there will be similar actions on other crises. I mean, as someone has pointed out, you know, there are as many Syrian refugees in Europe as there are Ukrainian ones at the moment. We didn't see a similar thing, you know, on a humanitarian scale for them. So it'd be interesting to see, as I said, whether it be collective action in future crises. I'd like us just to very briefly, as we come to the end, kind of have a bit of outlook. Julia, I mean, if we can come to you first. I mean, we've seen tentative ceasefire talks in Turkey between two foreign ministers. That's about as high up as it's got between the Ukraine and Russia to talk. That they focused inevitably and rightly on the humanitarian side, but there has been no talk of de-escalation or a wider ceasefire. So we are in this situation where we could be dug in for a long period. I mean, what does that mean for the industry? Do you sense we could find that Europe becomes a little bit of a tourism hot potato almost for travelers outside of the region?
Well, I was concerned about that and how it might impact confidence. But as we were saying earlier, the trends that I'm seeing that's not been happening. I think travelers have become much more discerning over the years, and American travelers, for example, coming to Europe, they don't necessarily see Ukraine, even though it clearly is part of Europe, the European continent. But I think they're quite sophisticated enough to distinguish, London and Madrid and, Berlin and places. So I think I'm still seeing the bookings holding up. So as I said before, although it is absolutely horrific what we're seeing, it might end up being quite contained in terms of its impact on demand globally.
And Nikita, just on this, if it's contained, it's prolonged, but contained to that particular region, Ukraine and Russia, do you sense that we could see some kind of new Iron Curtain? And I'm not talking just politically, I'm talking culturally as well, which, both Ukraine was very much struggling to come out of COVID before all of this happened. What does that mean for that region if we do get, as I say, the Iron Curtain return, sadly?
Well, the Iron Curtain is there already because, one of the things that is happening, counter sanctions are happening inside of Russia. So there's basically very limited access to foreign currencies for Russian individuals, for Russian businesses. It's becoming technically almost impossible to do any cross-border transactions. And the borders are almost closed in a sense that just a few airlines are still operating, international airlines. So I would say for Russia, definitely, if the government chooses the country to be isolated, it will be isolated. It is already. And with Ukraine, terrible things are happening on the territory of Ukraine these days. I don't think that they have the word travel or tourism in their mind, in their narrative.
Okay, Brian, we'll give the last word to you then, if we can. If it is prolonged, we hope it isn't. But what does that mean for the strategic ambitions of both Tripadvisor, but many, many other travel brands that want to reach into that region and just, ride a recovery, as we mentioned before, from COVID? If it puts pressure on the strategy of lots of brands.
Sure. Look, I would say to President Putin, to every oligarch who has financial interests in the economic interests of the Russian Federation, that it does not have to be this way, that they can also participate in an incredible global recovery that is happening around them right now as we come out of this awful pandemic. This awful pandemic does not need to be followed by this horrific war in Ukraine. And the power rests within their hands to come back to the global community and to participate in the interactions and benefits that we have by being a global community. And so Tripadvisor will continue to participate in that recovery that's happening post-pandemic. And we will continue to do business around the world as we expand in places like the Asia Pacific region and Latin America, in Africa, and other continents around the world. And we sure hope that that expansion can continue one day in Russia and Eastern Europe as well.
Okay, really appreciate the three of you joining me at a very hastily convened PhocusWire Flash here. We really appreciate your time. There's Julia Simpson from the WTTC, Brian Hoyt from Tripadvisor, and Nikita Dedic from road.travel. Wish you all well, your families well, and thank you very much to everybody for tuning in. A replay of this will be on PhocusWire.com, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and good day to you all.